Okay, here is where we left off last time, and what I'd like you to take a look at are the values that we have inside the ellipse function there. I arbitrarily decided on what they should be. I picked 150 for the x location of the alien's head, 67 for the y location, and so forth. But I didn't have to do that. I could have chosen many other different values. Now, think about your math courses that you've had. If you have an equation and there's a place in that equation that could accept many different values, then what you do is you use what's called a variable like x or y or z, and then later on you might plug in a value for that variable. Well, we're going to do the same thing here. Since we really could allow the x and y locations and the width and height of the alien's head to be many different values, we're going to use variables here instead, and then plug values in for those variables. Now, when you're computer programming, you should always pick variable names that are descriptive. So, for instance, here, the variable that I use for the x location of the alien's head might be something like head center x, and then here this is the y location, so head center y, and then over here this is the width and the height. Since we're going to make it a circle, those are always going to be the same, so why don't we just call this variable head size, and of course this would be the same variable. So now what we could do is we can now plug in values for these variables. And it might not be clear why this is valuable right now, but I think as we go on you'll see the value of doing something like this. Okay, so elsewhere in the program is where we will plug in values for these variables. But even before we do that, we have to, many programming languages, including processing, require you to create these variables. The proper word for it is to declare them. So for right now, we're going to declare our variables on top. So I'm going to make a space up here. Okay, so let's just list them. Head center x, head center y, and head size. Okay, but you also have to think of a variable as something that stores a piece of information, like a box that stores a piece of information. You have to let processing know here what kind of information you're going to store in there. Are you going to store a character, something that's called a string, perhaps? We'll deal with those later. For right now, we're always going to be storing numbers inside our variables. And the two kinds of numbers that we have to be concerned with right now are integers and numbers that are called floats. Integers are, think of integers kind of like whole numbers, 1, 2, but you could also have 0, you could also have -1, -2, and so forth. And think of floats as numbers that have a decimal part, so 1.5, 1.2, 2.7, those are floats. And I would say that I would always declare my variables to be floats unless they absolutely cannot be floats. So something that always has to be an integer, you should declare that to be an integer. But if it could be something that has a decimal part, then make them floats. And certainly the x and y location of the alien's head or its size, that could be anything. It doesn't have to be a whole number like 1 or 2. It could be something that has a decimal part. So I'm going to declare all of these as floats. So this, in a sense, creates these variables so that we can use them further on in our program. Now don't forget your semicolons. You always have to end all statements with a semicolon. Okay, so that takes care of that. And we already have these variables plugged in to our ellipse function. The only thing we have to do is we have to now put values into these variables so that when it sees head center x, it knows what value it should put in there. So probably the right place to put that would be before of course we have to do this before the ellipse function, but let's put it also before the fill statement, because these two statements here are basically what we're doing to draw the alien's head. So before we even do that, let's plug in our values. So head center x, we want that to be 150. Head center y, we want to be 67. You don't need all this white space, but I think it makes it more readable. And let's see, head size. We need that to be 100. Okay. And so now the variables have been declared. We have stored values into these variables. And so now we can plug these variables into our ellipse function, and it knows exactly what to do with them. If we wanted to change these values, we would just change them here. All right, instead of putting 150 here, we would put some other value there. And what's good about doing this is that as we move on in our programming, we can use these variables wherever we want, and if we need to change them, we only have to make one change, which would be right here. But if we actually put 150, 150, 150 all throughout the program, we would need to change all of those, and that becomes burdensome. So there's one value to using variables like this. So let's just convince you that this gives us the same output. And there you go. There's the alien's head. Same output. We've just done it differently using variables.